I had sat on the exchange floor for 31 years, and in that time I had learned to read a chorus the way another man reads weather. You watch the hands. They had 4 of them, the houses did 2 they used, set low and deliberate on the brass rail of their stalls, and 2 they kept folded against the sternum, pale and vestigial, the way a banker keeps a second pen he does not expect to need. When a house was certain of a thing, the folded hands lay still. When a house was uncertain, the folded hands stirred, a small dry rustle like paper settling. On the morning they convened to foreclose on earth, I looked across the whole tiered amphitheater of them, 600 houses in their stalls under the great glass dome, and not one set of folded hands was moving. That told me everything I needed to know about how the day was meant to go. The chamber was called the reckoning floor, though no one reckoned anything on it anymore. The figures were settled long before the doors opened, and the session was theater for the settling. It was a beautiful room, I will give them that. The dome above was a single sheet of poured glass a quarter-mile across, and through it the daylight of their home star came down white and even onto the marble, and you could see, hanging in that pale sky beyond the glass, the slow architecture of the exchange itself. The dock rings, the vaults, the long spars where the collateral of 1,000 conquered systems sat in bonded storage. They had built the seat of their power so that everyone who entered would look up through the roof and see, written in steel against the sky, exactly how much they owned. I did not look up. I had learned not to, years ago. A man who looks up at their ceiling has already conceded the argument. I sat where Earth's representative had always sat, at the low table on the chamber floor itself, below the tiers, where the light pooled and where every house in the room could look down on the top of your head. In front of me, weighted at the corners with little brass discs so the air handlers would not lift it, lay the instrument of the day. It was a long document, printed on the stiff vellum the houses used for matters of finality, and across the top of it ran their script, embossed and gilt, and beneath the script, in the trade tongue they permitted us, the translation, deed of foreclosure and articles of repossession, in the matter of the system designatd sole debtor. There was a line at the bottom for my mark. The presiding officer that session was the first reckoner, an old house named Sethaloo of the line of Verne, and Sethaloo was the closest thing the Korath had to a sovereign. He sat above all the others on the high stall at the head of the chamber, and his skin had the look that the very old ones got, like a candle that has cooled and set pale, faintly translucent, a webwork of darker veining beneath. His eyes were the vertical slits they all had, and they did not blink so much as close sideways, slowly, the way a door swings shut. When he spoke, the apparatus at his throat carried his voice in 2 registers at once, the dry undertone of the Korath speech and the chiming overtone that their language used for emphasis, and the 2 together made a sound like a man talking through a struck bell. The floor recognizes the representative of the debtor system, Sethaloo said, and the chime under it was the small flat chime they used for a matter beneath their dignity. Let it be noted that the debtor has been seated. A clerk somewhere in the tiers made the note. I inclined my head the precise amount that protocol required and not a hair more. I had learned the exact angle in my first year from the man who held the chair before me, a hard old envoy named Castellan who told me once over the bad wine they served in the annex that the entire job came down to one principle. They will take everything you offer and read it as weakness, he said. So offer nothing. Sit straight. Let them do the talking. The day you explain yourself to a Korath is the day you have lost. Castellan was 30 years dead. I had kept the chair, and I had kept the principle, and I had watched the houses take system after system off other men who had not learned it. The ones who came to the floor to argue, to plead the justice of their case, to lay out the long, reasonable history of how the debt had been manufactured against them. The Korath loved those men. They let them talk for hours. The folded hands stayed still the whole time, and at the end they foreclosed anyway. and the talking had bought the debtor nothing but the pleasure the houses took in hearing a doomed thing reason with the rope. So I said nothing. I sat straight. I let them do the talking, and they were glad to. I should explain the note, because the whole of the day turned on it, and a man who does not understand the note will not understand what happened in that room. The Korath did not conquer with fleets. They had fleets, you could see them parked in the bright sky beyond the dome, but the fleets were the collection agents, not the weapon. The weapon was the ledger. When the houses found a young system, a system new to the wider trade, they did not threaten it. They offered it terms. They extended it credit, generous credit, against future production, against the value of its worlds, against the labor of its people priced out a century in advance. They made the terms easy and the schedule long, and a young world, dazzled by the markets suddenly open to it, signed. Every system signed. Signing was the price of admission to the only economy that existed, and the alternative to signing was to remain a closed rock spinning alone in the dark while everyone around you grew rich. And then slowly, on a schedule the houses controlled to the day, the terms tightened. A revision here, a recalculation there, the value of your collateral marked down at the house's discretion, the schedule accelerated by clauses you had not read because no one read all of it, no one could. And one season the figures crossed, the way figures will, and your system was no longer a partner in the great trade. It was a debtor. And a debtor, under the law of the floor, held its worlds at the sufferance of its creditors. And when the creditors called the note, the fleets came not to fight but to collect, and the system passed quietly onto the books of the houses, another spar of bonded steel hanging in the bright sky over the reckoning floor. They had done this 400 times. 400 systems, the histories said, though the histories were the house's own and ran light. There was no fleet in the galaxy that had ever broken a Korath foreclosure, because the foreclosure was never the fight. By the time the houses called the note, the war was already lost in the arithmetic, and the arithmetic had been lost 100 years before, on the day a young and dazzled world put its mark on the first easy line. Earth had signed in the 3rd year of contact. I have read the original instrument. It is in our archive at home, in a case, behind glass, and we keep it there not as a trophy but as a warning, the way a family keeps the deed to a debt it spent 3 generations paying off. The men who signed it were not fools. They were given the choice every young world was given, the markets and the future, or the dark and the alone, and they chose the markets, the way every world chose, and they signed, and the terms began their long tightening, exactly as the terms always did. The maturation note was the instrument that crowned all of it. It was the master debt, the consolidated paper of an entire signatory system, and when a system's maturation note came due and could not be paid, the system was foreclosed. Saul's note had been declared mature that season. The figures had crossed. By the law of the floor we were a debtor in default, and the day had come to call it. That is what the document under the brass disc said. That is what 600 serene and certain houses had convened to ratify. That is the day I had been preparing for, in one form or another, for the better part of 30 years. Sethalu let the silence run a moment, the way he always did, and then the first reckoner began to read. He read well. The old ones always did. He read the history of the instrument, the date of signing, the long schedule of the terms, the revisions and the recalculations. Each one entered into the record as though it had fallen from heaven rather than been written by a house at a desk. He read the present valuation of the Sol system, the worlds, the orbital works, the population priced as labor against the outstanding balance. And the figure he read was a small one, smaller than I had expected, and I understood why a moment later, because a creditor who means to repossess a thing first marks it down. They had valued Earth at a fraction of a single year's trade across the floor. They had valued every human life on the books at less than the freight on a bonded grain ship. It was in the record now, in their own gilt script. This is what we think you are worth. I did not move. The folded hands across the tiers did not move. We were, the houses and I, in perfect agreement about how little they thought we were worth, and the only difference between us was that I had known the figure for years and had been doing something about it, and they did not yet know that I had. When Sethalu finished the reading, he closed the document before him and folded his lower hands on the brass rail, and the chime in his voice changed to the deeper register, the one they used for finality. "The instrument is mature," he said. "The debtor is in default. The floor will move to foreclosure." A house in the second tier rose, a younger one by the color, his skin still holding the faint blue of a house not yet a century in its stall, and made the motion in the formal words, and another seconded it, and Sethalu put it to the floor, and across 600 stalls the house is signified, and it was carried without a single set of folded hands so much as stirring, because there was nothing in the room to be uncertain about. The arithmetic had been settled 100 years before. The session was theater for the settling. The floor had foreclosed on earth. Sethalu turned the slow turn of his head down to where I sat in the pool of light. "The floor has voted," he said. "By the law of the exchange, the worlds of the debtor pass to the creditor upon the execution of the deed. The representative of the debtor will affix his mark, that the transfer be recorded as consenting, and the matter closed without the inconvenience of collection." That was the part they enjoyed most, I think, not the foreclosure itself, which was rote, but the moment when the debtor signed. They liked it consenting. They liked the conquered thing to put its own mark to its conquest, so that the record would show forever that the system had agreed it was worth what they said it was worth and had handed itself over willingly. Half the men who lost their worlds on that floor signed in the end. They signed because they had argued and lost and were broken, and signing was the last thing left to do with their hands. Castellan told me about a representative of a water world, decades back, who had wept while he signed, and how the houses had recorded the weeping in the minutes as evidence of the debtor's contrition. I did not weep. I did not reach for the document. I looked up at Sethalu, the one time that day I looked up, and I made it count, and I asked him a question. "First reckoner," I said, "which note are you calling?" The chamber did not understand the question. I had not expected it to. It was not the kind of question a debtor asked. A debtor asked for mercy, or for time, or for a recalculation, and the houses had heard all of those questions 10,000 times and had a serene, cold answer ready for each. A debtor did not ask which note. The note was the maturation note. There was only one. Everyone on the floor knew which note. Sethalu's folded hands did not move, but the slits of his eyes closed sideways once slowly and opened, which was the nearest a house of his age came to a frown. "The maturation note of the sol system," he said, "as the instrument before you records, the representative has heard it read." "I heard it read," I said. "I wanted it on the floor in your voice that the note being called is the maturation note of Saul. Thank you, first reckoner. The record will want it." And I let that sit. I want to be careful here, because this is the part that people at home have asked me about more than any other, in the years since. What I felt in that moment, with the foreclosure carried and the deed in front of me and 600 houses waiting for me to pick up the stylus and end my world with my own hand. They expect me to say I felt afraid, or that I felt triumphant, that there was some great surge in me as the trap I had spent 30 years building began to close. There was nothing like that. What I felt mostly was tired. I felt the way you feel at the very end of a long account, when the last column is added and the figure at the bottom is the figure you knew it would be, and there is no joy in being right, only the dry relief of having done the arithmetic correctly. I thought of Castellan, and of the water world representative who wept, and of all the men on all the worlds who had sat where I sat and signed because there was nothing left to do with their hands. I thought, I have something left to do with mine. I reached down to the case at my feet. They had searched it at the door, of course, and found in it only documents and a few ledger chips, the ordinary clutter of a trade mission, nothing they would think to stop. And I took out a single chip, a small square of bonded crystal in a plain dark sleeve, and I laid it on the table beside the deed, square to the edge, the way you set down a thing you mean to be noticed. Before I mark the deed, I said, the first reckoner should read this into the record. It bears on the matter of the note. A house 2 tiers up made the dry sound they made when they were amused, a sound like sand poured from one hand to another. They thought I had brought a counterclaim. Debtors did that sometimes, produce some old grievance, some side debt the houses owed them, a freight overcharge or a damaged shipment, and tried to set it against the foreclosure as though a creditor owed to foreclose around your complaints. The houses found it charming. They would read the thing, dismiss it, and foreclose, and the dismissal would be one more pleasure in a pleasant morning. Sethalou signified to a clerk, and the clerk came down from the tiers and took up my chip in his 2 working hands and carried it to the reader at the foot of the high stall, and slotted it, and the great display behind Sethalou. They did not use floating projections in that chamber, nothing so vulgar. The display was a wall of fitted glass panels that lit from within, an honest surface a man could read. The great display behind Sethalou woke and began to fill with the contents of the chip. I watched the houses read it. I had 30 years' practice at reading them, and I read them now while they read me. The first thing on the chip was a list. It was a long list, and it was a dull list, and the house's eyes went down it the way eyes go down anything dull, quickly at first, looking for the part that matters. It was a list of debt instruments, not Saul's debt, other systems' debt, old paper, distressed paper, the defaulted notes of small dead worlds, the orphan tranches of foreclosures decades closed, the worthless scrip of systems the houses had repossessed and stripped and forgotten. Hundreds of lines of it, thousands, the kind of paper that traded for a fraction of a fraction, that the houses themselves dumped onto the secondary floor when they cleared their books, that nobody bought because there was nothing left in it to collect. It was, to a house, garbage, the lint of the great economy, the sweepings of the collection halls. Earth had been buying it for 40 years. I watched the realization not arrive. That was the thing I will remember longest about that morning, the long flat plane of time during which the houses read the list and did not understand it, because it was a list of garbage, and they could not conceive of why a debtor in its final hour would waste the floor's time reading them an inventory of its own foolish purchases of worthless dead paper. A house in the high tier made the sand sound again. The folded hand stayed still. They thought, I am certain, that the doomed debtor had brought to its own foreclosure a list of all the bad investments it had made on the way down, that I was, in some human way they did not follow, confessing. Then the list ended, and the second part of the chip began, and the second part was not a list. It was a single page, and on it was a chain of title. I had a man at home, an old accountant named Reuben Sand, who had built the chain over the better part of his career, and he had built it the way the houses built their foreclosures. Patiently, in the arithmetic, 100 small moves that meant nothing one at a time. Reuben used to say that the Korath had one weakness, and the weakness was that they believed their own ledger. They believed that worth was the number they assigned, that a thing marked down was a thing made small, that the garbage they dumped on the secondary floor was garbage because they had decided it was. They did not look at what the garbage was a claim against. Because here was the thing the houses had forgotten in 400 years of foreclosing on worlds. The maturation note, the great instrument. The master debt by which they owned a system was not a thing the houses created out of nothing. It was collateralized. Every maturation note the houses issued was backed, under the founding law of the exchange, by a corresponding claim on the house's own sovereign charter, the original deed of the exchange itself, the instrument by which 600 houses held the right to call notes at all. It was a closed circle, an elegant one. The house's power to own you was itself a kind of debt, an obligation written against their charter, and the holder of that obligation was, by definition, the senior creditor of the exchange. For 4 centuries no one had held it, because the obligation had been split on the founding day into 10,000 tranches and scattered into the body of the market as a formality, a legal nicety, the kind of paper that is issued so that the law is satisfied and then forgotten. The tranches had decayed into exactly the sort of worthless dead scrip that the houses dumped on the secondary floor. They had been buying their own sovereign collateral back and throwing it in the bin for 400 years, and the bin was the secondary floor. And the secondary floor was where a small deferential human trade mission had sat for 40 years, quiet, unthreatening, buying the paper nobody wanted. We had not bought all of it. You did not need all of it. You needed a controlling tranche of the senior claim, and Reuben had calculated the threshold to 4 decimal places, and we had crossed it 11 years ago, and we had kept buying anyway, quietly to be sure. While at home 3 generations of trade missions sat straight on the floor and said nothing, and let the houses tighten the terms on Saul and mark us down and value our lives at less than the freight on grain. Because the whole of the strategy depended on the houses going right on believing exactly that until the morning they convened to foreclose. The chain of title on the second page of the chip showed it all. It showed that the holder of the controlling tranche of the senior claim on the sovereign charter of the sovereign exchange of the Korath houses, the senior creditor of the whole apparatus, the party to whom the houses own power to call notes, was a standing debt, was the system designated Saul. And it showed one more thing, the thing Reuben had built the whole chain to deliver, the thing that made it not a clever defense but a closing trap. Under the founding law of the exchange, the house's own law, the law they had written to make their foreclosures unbreakable, the law that said the senior claim always took the floor, a foreclosure executed by a debtor of the senior creditor did not transfer the foreclosed worlds to the creditor of record. It transferred them to the senior creditor. The houses had voted to foreclose on earth, and by their own law, the worlds of a foreclosed debtor passed to the party holding the senior claim, and the party holding the senior claim was the party they had just foreclosed for, which was us. They had not voted to take Saul. They had voted to deliver Saul to its senior creditor, and stacked behind Saul, under the same clause, every system on which the houses currently held a maturation note, 400 systems of bonded worlds hanging in the bright sky beyond the dome, because the senior claim, once it took the floor, took all of it. They had built the law so that nothing could ever break a foreclosure. They had built it so well that they could not break this one either. I watched the realization arrive then. It did not come all at once. It came up through the tiers like a tide coming up a flat shore, from the younger houses first, the blue-skinned ones, the ones still quick, and you could see it in the hands. The folded hands began to move. 2 stalls in the 3rd tier, then a row, then a whole arc of them, the dry rustle of vestigial fingers stirring against pale sternums, a sound that ran round the chamber and grew, 600 houses folded hands all coming awake at once, and the sound of it under that great glass dome was like wind getting into a granary, like the first stir of something that had been still for 400 years. Sethalu did not move his hands. He was too old. He had read the second page faster than any of them, I think, and he held himself still by an effort I could see in the set of his lower arms on the brass rail, and his eyes had closed sideways and stayed, closed a long moment, and when they opened he looked down at me, and the 2 registers of his voice when he spoke had fallen out of true, the chime dragging behind the undertone, so that for the first time in 30 years I heard a Korath's voice come apart. "This is not," he said and stopped. "This instrument is not. The senior claim was retired. The founding tranches were retired. There is no senior creditor of the exchange. There has not been a senior creditor of the exchange in 400 years. There is now," I said. "You sold the tranches, first reckoner. Your house has sold them over 400 years a little at a time onto the secondary floor because you marked them worthless and you wanted them off your books. We bought them. We have been buying them since the 3rd decade of contact. We crossed control 11 years ago. The chain is on your display in your own registry's hand. Your clerks recorded every transfer as it happened. You have the record. You have always had the record." You simply never read it, because you knew what we were worth, and a thing worth that little does not buy the world out from under you while you watch. I did not raise my voice. There is a temptation in a moment like that to raise the voice, to let 30 years and 400 foreclosed systems and a man who wept while he signed all come up out of you at once and break over the room. I felt the temptation. I did not yield to it. Castellan again. The day you explain yourself to a Korath is the day you have lost. I had not come to explain. I had come to read them their own ledger, and the ledger explained itself. And a man who has the arithmetic on his side does not need to shout it. A house in the front tier rose, not the young one who had made the motion, an older one, gray-skinned, a house of weight. And he said, into the rising sound of the chamber, the thing they always said, the thing 400 broken worlds had said before him and never once made true. Then we will not execute the deed, he said. The foreclosure is withdrawn. The floor reverses its vote. Let the matter be struck from the record and the session closed. And there it was. The last move, the move that should have worked, the move that had always worked because the houses controlled the record and the law and the floor, and a creditor who finds it has made a mistake simply unmakes the mistake and strikes the mourning from the books. I had known they would reach for it. Reuben had known. It was why we had waited, why we had let the foreclosure be moved and seconded and put to the floor and carried and entered before I ever reached into the case at my feet. You cannot withdraw it, I said. It is executed not by my mark, by yours. The deed of foreclosure is executed upon the carrying of the vote. The representatives mark records consent, but the instrument is mature and the transfer is effected at the vote by the law you read into this record not 1 hour ago. The first reckoner read it himself. The debtor was in default. The floor moved to foreclosure. The motion was made, seconded, and carried. The transfer was effected at the carrying. Your law does not permit a foreclosure to be unwound once the transfer is effected. You wrote it that way. You wrote it that way so that no debtor could ever beg back what the floor had taken. There is no clause to withdraw. There has never been a clause to withdraw. You made certain of it. The gray house did not sit. He stood with his lower hands open on the rail and his folded hands moving, and he had no answer, because there was no answer, because the answer was the law, and the law was theirs. I have thought a great deal since about why we won. People at home want it to be that we were clever, and we were clever. Reuben was clever, and the patience of 30 years of representatives was a kind of genius that does not get called genius because it looks, from outside, like sitting quietly and doing nothing. But that is not finally why we won. We won because the houses had built a machine for owning things, and the machine ran on one assumption, which was that worth is what they say it is. They marked us down and they believed the markdown. They threw their own sovereignty in the bin and called it garbage because they had decided it was garbage. And a thing they had decided was garbage could not possibly be the senior claim on everything they were. They were undone not by our fleet. We have no fleet that could face theirs, and not by our worlds, which they had valued correctly as small, but by their own certainty that they knew the price of everything in the galaxy. The one price they never checked was the price of the paper they were sweeping off the floor. The one debtor they never thought to read was themselves. The chamber had gone by then, very quiet. The first storm of stirring hands had passed, the way a wind drops, and what came after was worse for them and better for me. A stillness that was not the serene stillness of the morning, but its opposite, the stillness of 600 houses who had all, at the same moment, finished the arithmetic and found the figure at the bottom, and understood that there was no joy in being right and no escape from it either. The bright sky beyond the dome had not changed. The dock rings still hung there, the vaults, the long spars of bonded steel, 400 systems of repossessed worlds, every one of them now standing, under the law of the floor, as part of the estate that had passed to the senior creditor at the carrying of a vote the houses had been so eager to carry. They had spent the morning admiring their own ceiling. They had not thought to ask, until I asked it, whose ceiling it now was. Sethalou sat above all of it on the high stall, the oldest creditor in the room, and he looked down at me for a long time, and his eyes closed sideways and opened, and his voice when it came had found its two registers again, drawn them back into true by some last discipline of a very old house, so that he spoke once more in the bell-struck double tone, level now, almost gentle. "You have sat on this floor for many years," he said. "I have watched you sit. I took it for the patience of a small thing that has accepted its size. I did not consider that a thing may sit still because it is counting." "We were counting," I said. 40 years. Longer than that. Castellan started it. He had the chair before me. He bought the first tranche the year I was born, on a hunch, against the rules of his own mission, and he wrote a memorandum that no one read for a decade explaining why it might one day matter. We have been counting since before I could count. "And now," Cthulhu said, "you hold the senior claim, and the law of the exchange is your law, and the worlds of the foreclosure are your worlds, and the 400 systems on which we hold the maturation notes are, by the clause that takes all, attached to the senior claim and pass with it." He said it not as a question. He was reading me the ledger now, the way I had read it to him, and there is a thing the very old ones have, even at the bottom of a ruin, which is the discipline to state the figure correctly. You have not merely escaped the foreclosure. You have foreclosed the houses. "By your law," I said. "I want that in the record too, not by ours. We have no law that reaches this floor. We used yours. Every step of it is yours, the note, the schedule, the foreclosure, the clause that takes all, the rule that the senior claim takes the floor, the rule that a transfer once effected cannot be withdrawn. We did not break a single one of your rules. We followed all of them. That is the whole of what we did. We read your ledger more carefully than you did, and we waited, and we followed your rules to the place your rules went. There is a thing I had decided, in the long years of preparing for that morning, that I would not do, and I did not do it. I would not gloat. I would not stand and tell them what they were, the 400 worlds and the man who wept and the lives valued at less than grain. I would not deliver the speech that every fiber of 30 years wanted me to deliver, because the speech was for me, not for the record, and the speech would have given them, at the very end, the one thing I had spent 3 decades refusing them, the sight of a human explaining himself on their floor. I had not come to be understood. I had come to be the senior creditor, and the senior creditor does not explain. So when Cthulhu had finished reading the ledger back to me, and the chamber waited for what I would do, whether I would seize it now, name my terms, call the fleets that were now, under the law, mine to call, I did the thing I had decided I would do, which was very nearly nothing. I picked up the deed of foreclosure with the line at the bottom for my mark. I did not sign it. I turned it over face down and squared it to the edge of the table the way I had squared the chip, and I left it there. Then I took the stylus they had set out for me, a fine thing, weighted, the kind of stylus a house would use to sign away another world, and I set it down across the document, crosswise, and I folded my hands on the table in front of me, both of them, the way they folded theirs, and I said the only other thing I said that morning. "Then read your own," I said, "all of you. The session is yours to close. I will sit while you do it. I have time." And I sat. I want to tell you that I felt in that moment the great thing that the room, the 400 worlds, the bright spars in the sky, that all of it came up in me as victory. It did not. What I felt, with the deed face down under the stylus and my hands folded, and 600 houses bent over their displays reading the chain of title in their own registry's hand, was the thing I had felt at the start, the dry relief of a long account come out right, and under it, very far down, a sorrow I had not expected and did not welcome, because I was thinking, in the quiet, of the worlds that had not had a castellan, the water world whose representative wept, the 400 systems whose people had signed in good faith in the 3rd year of their own contact, and been marked down and tightened and called, and who had had no one buying the worthless paper for 40 years, no Reuben at a desk building a chain of title no one read, no 30 years of representatives sitting straight and saying nothing. We had not beaten the houses because we were better than those worlds. We had beaten them because Castellan had a hunch the year I was born, and we got lucky in the men who came after him, and the houses got unlucky in their certainty. It could as easily have gone the other way on any one of 10,000 mornings, and on 400 other mornings it had gone the other way, and there was nothing in my winning that gave any of those 400 worlds back. The senior claim took all of it. The worlds would come home now, the ones that still had anyone to come home to. But the man who wept was 30 years dead, and the figure at the bottom of his account had been read out on this floor by a house whose folded hands did not move, and I had won my morning too late to do a thing for him. So I did not gloat, and I did not call the fleets, and I did not name terms. I sat with my hands folded and let the houses read their own ledger, and the daylight came down white and even through the great glass dome onto the marble, and the bonded worlds hung in the bright sky beyond the glass, and one by one, around the tiers, the folded hands of 600 houses went still again, not the serene stillness of the morning, but the stillness that comes after, when there is nothing left to be uncertain about and nothing left to do with your hands. Cthulhu was the last to move. He sat a long while on the high stall, the oldest creditor in a room that was no longer his, and at length he reached out with one lower hand and closed the document on the rail before him, the foreclosure he had read into the record 1 hour past, and he folded all 4 of his hands against his sternum, working and vestigial together, which I had never seen a house do, and which I understood after a moment was the gesture they made over a debt that could not be paid. "The floor," he said, in the level double tone, "recognizes the senior creditor of the exchange." I inclined my head the precise amount that protocol required, and not a hair more, the way Castellan had taught me in my first year. On the day I learned that the entire job came down to one principle, and that the principle was to offer nothing and let them do the talking. They had done the talking. They had read it all into the record in their own voices under their own law, and the record would keep it now, forever, the foreclosure and the chain of title and the clause that takes all, and the senior claim that took the floor. There was nothing more for me to add to it. A man who has the arithmetic on his side does not need to say what the arithmetic means. The figure at the bottom says it. I sat in the pool of white daylight below the tiers, my hands folded and the deed face down under the stylus, and I did not look up at their ceiling, because it was not their ceiling anymore. And a man does not need to look up at a thing to know that it is his.